Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet.
Ad Astra, the podcast where we talk about the intersection between space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack, your resident space policy advocate.
And I'm Newton. I'm your guy for space technology.
And today we have a special guest.
Hey Zoe, this is Zoe Aldrich from the once loved, once coveted Straight Up podcast.
Oh yes, rest in peace.
What's going on, Zoe?
Not much. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, no problem. We just thought we'd have Zoe on today because we're having a good news episode. We're actually going to be talking about positive things, and when we think positive, we think Zoe.
I think also when you think climate change, you think Zoe. So
all right,
multiple purposes for being on this episode, not to give the topic away.
That's fair. But getting into the topic, that's what we're going to be covering today. Instead of the diatribe that we went on in our last episode about all the negative things that are going on in climate change, we're actually going to be talking about some of the positive things. But we'll get to that later today in our Space News Highlight of the Week. Before getting to that, we have some breaking news about Hubble. Then we're going to dive into our latest from Washington section, where we talk about the Space Force and some of the Vice President's remarks about that. And then we'll dive into climate change. So let's get started with a little bit of the news about Hubble. NASA basically pulled a me when it comes to actually fixing any piece of equipment, and basically fixed the faulty gyroscope on the Hubble Space Telescope spacecraft by turning it off and turning it on again. On October 27th, NASA Hubble Space Telescope resumed normal operations after controllers fixed a faulty gyroscope on the spacecraft. In a statement, NASA said that Hubble resumed normal science operations at 9 p.m. Eastern on October 26th and completed its first science observations of a distant galaxy using the spacecraft's Wide Field Camera 3 instrument about 5 hours later. The observations were the first that Hubble made since the October 5th failure of the third of 6 gyros on the spacecraft. The spacecraft was placed into safe mode when one of the remaining 3 gyroscopes turned on after having been held in reserve, and reported rates far higher than actual ones. So they noticed that's a big delta between the measured data that the gyroscope was pulling off and the expected, and so they shut it off. Engineers eventually found a way to lower the anomalously high rates from that gyro, designated Gyro 3, by performing a series of maneuvers that appeared to clear a blockage within the actual gyro. By October 22nd, NASA said that the rates from the gyro went back to normal, and we're performing additional engineering tests to confirm that the gyro was working properly. That's the breaking news from Hubble.
Yeah. Hey, some good news. I mean, I remember it's kind of gotten buried under a lot of bad news over the last couple weeks, and especially over the last week. But since October 5th, we haven't had the Hubble Space Telescope, which, I mean, was a major investment for the United States at the end of the Cold War as we were transitioning more over to a civilian-focused space program. And, it was launched in 1990, and the last time it was serviced a couple times over its lifespan. And the last time was in 2009, one of the last shuttle flights. And Hubble is expected to survive into the 2020s, so long as incidents like this don't become more regular. So,
well, they will. I mean,
they'll become more regular,
that's just the nature of things,
yeah.
Right? And I mean, this is a sort of a hefty reminder as to why we're going through all of this testing with the James Webb Space Telescope. I mean, we can go up and we can fix Hubble. We can have some near-Earth communications with Hubble. Not that the communications will be that terrible with James Webb, but it will be at a much greater distance away from the Earth. Once again, on L2, about a million miles away. I think it's a little bit more than that.
Yeah, it's like 1.1 million, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. But it'll be really far away. So we definitely can't do manual service on it.
That's 4 times the distance to the moon. For anybody listening, that's a 4-second time delay.
Yeah, exactly. So that'll be difficult for doing things like measuring errors and even detecting anomalies based on how, we pull real-time data from Hubble, and even a few second delay could actually be damaging. But we have gone up and fixed Hubble multiple times physically. I actually sent people up, the most notable being in the 90s when we actually had to send folks like Mike Massimino up to fix the mirror, actually replace one of the mirrors on the Hubble. And that's just something that we can't have happen with the James Webb. That we're not going to send folks up to do that kind of work. And and we just have to make sure we get it right.
Yeah. So I guess that validates that $800 million extra price tag.
Yeah, I'd say so.
This is the good news episode.
Yes. Good news. It's all about good news.
Yeah. Well, hey, Hubble is operational again, and gives us hope for a few more years of service despite some technical problems. And they still have the backup program of only using one of the remaining 3 gyroscopes, which could extend the lifespan of Hubble well into the 2020s. But it's starting to become contingency plans when these things start to fail. But there are plans. Good news.
Yes.
It's back online.
All right, moving on to latest from Washington.
So, latest from Washington. So, I think we're going to do a much more extensive, in-depth look at the Space Force. I know over the last couple episodes we haven't directly said those words, Space Force, but as we move into a new Congress starting next January, as the midterm elections are wrapping up next week, remember, go vote, we deemed it somewhat necessary to maybe dedicate a little bit of time to Space Force. So,
I mean, and also we've got Zoe here, big proponent, proponent.
Huge.
I mean, my biggest question is whenever you talk about Space Force, are you obligated to sing it like it's an action title, like Space Force? Because I feel like that's a really integral part of the program.
Only if I get to carry a backing track with me everywhere I go. Space Force. But so last week there were 2 major events that happened all on the same day, all on October 23rd. So in the morning of the 23rd, the Washington Post held an event called Transformers Space, and it was this massive event with multiple panels involving astronauts, Bill Nye, members of the scientific community, members of NASA, Administrator Jim Bridenstine, and the Vice President.
A number of actual Transformers.
Yeah, my question is, who's the nerd, amongst all those nerds that was like, you know what we need to call this launch? Transformers.
Well, it's supposedly a part of like some ongoing series, but I think this might actually be the first one that they Transformers blank. And I don't know if they're going to do like Transformers Infrastructure Week, but like
they're going to have to fight Hasbro for some of those titles. I mean, it's a 30-year-old franchise. They've used Transformers blank on, I think, for most
you know what?
words
I think they do have to stop because I think Transformers Space Force was already taken by Hasbro.
God.
I would not be surprised.
But so at this event, the vice president came in and had a conversation with Robert Costa at the Washington Post and answered some pretty pointed questions about other things going on in national and international politics, everything ranging from the stuff that's been going on in Turkey and Saudi Arabia to the caravan to Space Force is the main topic of discussion here. And what the vice president said, I thought was very at times measured and at other times really hearkening back to why this administration is in office to begin with, sort of a hyper nationalism, really kind of going back to we need to quote make America great again with the statements of we need to ensure dominance in space and make sure our international partners know that we're number one, all that kind of stuff. But what he talked about there and then later at the National Space Council meeting, where he actually laid out these 6 proposed recommendations in a space policy directive for the president to sign, is that we're going to be moving forward with Space Force in a much more measured and reasoned pace. Maybe some of the language that was talked about is a little optimistic from the administration's perspective, saying that by by fiscal year 2020, we're going to start spending some of that proposed $13 billion on Space Force, as a report that Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, came out with last month, saying that it was going to cost about $13 billion in the first 5 years to operate a Space Force. But these 6 recommendations that he laid out, that the vice president laid out at the Space Council hearing and alluded to in his talk at the Washington Post, was that the first thing we'll do is create a new unified U.S. Space Command, something akin to what we had in the 80s and 90s before it was reabsorbed back into Strategic Command during the sort of conglomeration of all of our Homeland Security elements at the beginning of the 21st century. So we're going to start with a space command. The second recommendation being have the Secretary of Defense create a joint space development agency within the Department of Defense that would cut through the bureaucracy and figure out what the organizational structure will look like for a Space Force in the future. Third recommendation, work with the National Security Council to conduct a comprehensive review of the current interagency authorities to make sure warfighters can react flexibly to stop threats in space. That one essentially just making sure that we can continue doing what we are doing in space and expand our capabilities while at the same time existing within the current regulatory and authoritarian structure that we have in the U.S. government. The fourth recommendation, work with the Congress essentially to create legislation for a Space Force in the National Defense Authorization Act that is supposed to be coming out next year. The fifth, address the 2020 budget and set up what the funding mechanisms will be for Space Force. And six, strengthen the relationship between the intelligence community and the Space Force. So something, I guess, Newton, you and I and a few others talked about, and Zoe too, at dinner the other day about sort of that love language between the intelligence community and the different branches of the armed forces and how we communicate data sets, how we communicate information about what's going on in and from space. So those are the 6 recommendations. We're going to talk more about this in the next couple weeks as we know the result of next week's midterm elections. But I don't know, on the onset, Newton, Zoe, do you have any critical thoughts on this?
I have a few.
Just a few?
Well, I'm not going to list them all here because we have actual news in the episode to get to.
And it's a happy episode. It's a happy episode. Remember, Newton.
I just find it interesting that there's already the language of pushing it for the budget in 2020, and I'm actually wondering how much of the budget will that actually take up versus budget post 2020 election. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so remember, so there's not just the fiscal year 2020 budget before the 2020 election. It's also the 2021 fiscal year budget. Right. And if Democrats take the House, and we're talking a very realistic probability, looking at numbers from 538 and New York Times and Real Clear Politics, that the administration is going to be working with a divided Congress on not only appropriations acts, which fund these operations that the administration wants to move forward with, but also the authorization to even have that funding in the first place. So if a National Defense Authorization Act, which generally starts in the House anyway, does not include the Space Force because the quote-unquote leadership that the administration has worked with to develop in recommendation for what that legislation is, and the Democrats come in and say, well, no, we have this totally different idea for Space Force or for Space Command, or extend the life of Space Command beyond 2020 and into the mid-2020s. All this stuff is optimistic for the administration, and they're trying to get as much through before the November elections and before their term in office is theoretically done after the 2020 election. So I think there's a level of going into next year. They know that they're going to have to be measured, and they know they're going to have to maybe concede on a few of these things so that it's not just the hill that they die on. I don't think this is something the $5 billion in that first year, the administration's going to say, yeah, I think this is where we're going to stake our entire political future on this, $5 billion in the first year program.
Yeah. And I mean, and on the flip side, let's go down the path of, we don't see a blue wave. Republicans can maintain control of Congress, right? I mean, there's already been a lot of talk about how they want to gut the social safety net programs moving ahead. So, with their continued insistence on cutting taxes, but also cutting these larger programs, it would be interesting to see if they do face any additional blowback from their constituents. When people do start seeing the services they're used to receiving disappear. And I mean, the U.S. has always had a very large military defense budget, so it's possible that Space Force would sort of sneak by, public outrage under, the guise of that. But it'll be interesting to see.
Happy episode, Zoe.
I'm just saying, we can't. It's early to assume. We still don't know which way the midterms are going to go. So,
and it's not even just like the full control of the Congress that matters. What also matters is key constituencies coming out to vote. So if the big proponents of Space Force don't get reelected, or don't get reelected in a high enough number that there's a concerted effort on the Hill for Space Force, you could see that this proposal falls by the wayside and is just something that got jump-started by the administration that never really took off, pun intended.
Wow. Moving on.
Moving on. We'll have more about this stuff after the election, but just remember, go vote.
Go vote. And we could either be celebrating or drinking on the next episode.
I mean, why not both?
I mean, we'll probably
Why not both? Make sure you know your polling place. Make sure you're registered. Make sure you know how to ask for a provisional ballot in case you get turned away at your polling place. Be prepared.
Vote early, vote often.
We'll have some links in the show notes. I got a bunch of stuff from vote.org and stuff for you to check if you are concerned about your voter registration.
All right. Sounds good. Okay. So, yeah, one of the things that I wanted to really feature for the space news highlight of the week is sort of the positive things about about where we are with climate change. I know in the last episode we just kind of talked about death and destruction and doom and gloom.
That's not new for us at all.
No. But we're actually making progress, and I kind of wanted to highlight that. I mean, everywhere you look, the message is clear. We must act now to avoid environmental disaster. We saw reports from NSpC recently saying that. We were saying that previously. Our current administration doesn't seem to care. But last year's landmark Paris Agreement and the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals show that the political will, at least in parts of the planet, are still there. And I wanted to even show something that says that while the political will may not necessarily be there for the U.S., many of our programs, many of the things that we put in place previously are still around, and we're continuing that work, and there's good work being done. The first thing I wanted to talk about are some of the scientific assessments, and we brought some of this up in our last few episodes. So now, scientific assessments are essential tools for linking science and decision-making, basically. They survey and synthesize science within and between disciplines and across sectors and regions. They highlight key knowledge that can improve policy choices and identify significant gaps that can limit effective decision-making. Assessments also track progress by identifying, in this case, changes in the condition of the Earth, changes in human response, and advances in science over time. And a group called the U.S. Global Change Research Program was established back in 1989 by a presidential initiative and was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990. Its mandate was to develop and coordinate a comprehensive and integrated United States research program which will assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global climate change. That group, the USGCRP, comprises 13 different federal agencies that conduct or use research on global change and its impact on society. It functions under the direction of the Subcommittee on Global Change Research of the National Science and Technology Council's Committee on Environment, Natural Resources, and Sustainability. Assessments have been integral components of USGCRP since our inception, and one that we have talked about quite often here is the National Climate Assessment, which we have a legal mandate to conduct the National Climate Assessment every 4 years, the third and most recent of which was released back in May 2014, and we are still working on the fourth, which actually, I'm sorry, we reported on the fourth this year. The draft of
Volume
the fourth
1 came out
yes.
last year, and then Volume 2 we're still waiting.
Yes. Well, it's effectively counted as a draft. And while the USGCRP team is still working on this, I wanted to point out that they recently did enough analysis for Volume 2 to actually update key indicators of global climate change. So this is just showing some of the research results that we've produced since then. So certain aspects of our global system provide clear indications of how the climate is changing. Most people know these things like surface temperatures, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, when they talk about like things like parts per million in the atmosphere, sea ice extent, glacier mass, so on and so on. All of these count as aspects of our climate systems that are called climate indicators. The more they change, they the more that we can assess that our overall climate is changing. And the U.S. Global Change Research Program actually just recently updated its collections of indicators with the latest data and graphics, many of which you can actually check out on their website. Many of the indicators in the USGCRP selection are similar to those from other sources, such as the yearly State of the Climate Report or Climate.gov's own Global Climate Change dashboard. One may vary slightly from the other depending on the source of its data, but they all reveal the same trends. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas concentrations are increasing, temperatures are warming, sea levels are rising, and ice extent and glacier mass are decreasing. Once again, happy episode. So here are the updates.
We got to get the bad stuff out of the way.
Set the stage.
Yes.
It's only up from here, folks.
Yes.
Sea levels, that is.
So here are the other indicators that, just a few of the indicators that they found thus far. So the first, the first thing that they talk about is the start of spring indicator, which, quote, when growth can begin for temperature-sensitive, native, and cultivated plants. So they don't actually mean the actual day of the year when spring season starts. They just talk about when growth has actually begun. And this one's interesting. So since 1984, the start of spring in the United States has occurred earlier relative to the last century's average, according to the USCGRP. And the earliest start was actually back in 2012. So now they've discovered that this is at least one of the key indicators about how the climate is warming, and a trend that we're going to continue to follow going forward. Have either of you noticed that spring has started earlier?
I mean, weather in DC is always weird. We're always kind of all over the place. But I mean, not only have I felt like the start date of spring has changed, but also that we've seen a shift in what we can expect month to month, right? Like growing up in this area, May has always been this like beautiful month where, it's not cold, but it's also not ridiculously humid yet. It's usually blue skies. And the last 3 to 4 years, it's been miserable. May has not been an enjoyable month the last couple of years.
That's very true. It's been kind of balmy.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know the old adage that spring is the best 2 weeks in DC. I think it's starting to become more like 1 week.
Very true. Very true. So the next indicator that they found is the heavy rain indicator. I think this one's kind of obvious. How much of a location's precipitation falls in heavy single-day events has big consequences for society, from public health and safety to the impact on roads and other infrastructure. So you see things like the spread of disease and things like that can tend to increase when it comes to in direct correlation with how much precipitation is falling. Global warming may cause more heavy rain, because a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor, which can then make more precipitation. Also, warming may impact the frequency of heavy precipitation events. And I mean, I'm thinking back to the summer, not to correlate these things kind of just offhand, but I'm thinking back to the summer, like there were weeks literally where it was just pouring here. Like I felt like we lived in Seattle.
Some good examples are, again, speaking as a mostly lifelong Maryland resident, as in the last 2 years, Old Ellicott City, up in Maryland, outside of Baltimore, has catastrophically flooded twice in the last 2 years. And when it happened back in 2016, we were told, oh, this is a once in a 1,000-year flood. It's not going to happen again. The entire downtown area was destroyed. We're talking like 10 plus feet of water. And then it happened again earlier this year. And we also had really catastrophic flooding in old historic Frederick as well. And, yes, there's things to be said about the role that development and stormwater runoff have to play in these disasters. But there's definitely, we can see the weather data that the rainfall patterns have changed in this area, and that it's, we're more commonly seeing really intense bursts of storms that just like stay over one concentrated area and just dump way too much water in one specific area. So, but happy episode, right?
We're trying to be as happy as possible. At least the flowers look better this year.
I am just stating that the reason we're happy that we're reporting any of this is because I'm saying we know more, right? That's effectively what this is saying is that we can actually solidly state that these are actual indicators based on all of the data that we collected. So in the context of heavy precipitation, their studies actually define events as the top 1% of single-day rainfall totals during a set time period. So the USGCRP compared two different time periods to get this, 1901 through 1960 and 1986 through 2016, to determine how much precipitation falls as heavy rain now compared to in the past. What this comparison found is that more rain is falling as heavy rain across most of the United States, and actually particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest, which, once again, not surprising. Both Jack and I are from the Midwest, and we've heard more than enough reports from up there.
Actually, I haven't heard from them in a while. I think they're buried under snow right now.
Well, they had a good run.
There goes the whole mitten.
Yep. There goes
all 20 electoral votes.
I know, all three of our fans in Michigan. We don't give a damn about this whole state of Michigan. Anyway.
Hey, there are some good things in Michigan.
Yeah, like not Ohio State.
Oh. Moving on. The USGCRP also added a new indicator based on an EPA analysis and NOAA data to evaluate trends in U.S. heat waves, one of our favorite subjects. This is another one which can cause illness or death, harm agriculture, and impact infrastructure. In order to see how climate change impacts the frequency of heat waves and the length of the heat wave season, the USGCRP classifies a heat wave as a period of 2 or more consecutive days on which the overnight low temperatures, after being adjusted for humidity, exceed the 85th percentile of the historical average for a given city. I'm trying to think back. Did we have significant heat waves here in DC? I mean, it was humid as usual. But this year, did we have anything?
I mean,
there weren't as many days that were 3 digits or above as previous years.
Yeah, I would agree.
But it was above 90 degrees a higher percentage of the time than any year previous to this. So it wasn't as hot, but it was hot for longer.
We're not saying because we didn't see it this year that it's not occur. I'm just thinking back to whether or not we saw any of that actually this year.
Well, I mean, that goes back to the whole conversation that we often have with climate change deniers, people that don't accept climate change as fact, that they're like, oh, well, like, it always fluctuates and always goes up and it always goes down. You don't see these trends over a long period of time because you live day to day, right? So you might not see that this year is warmer on average than previous years until you compare the actual data set, which goes back to your point, Newton, of why it's so important that we have comprehensive and full data sets on all of these indicators.
Well, speaking of somebody who's worked on some of these like dashboards and things like that, that's sort of the power behind it, because even more to the point, not only do we see things from day to day, we view a year as a long time, because within our lives that's a long time. But a year in the context of the Earth is not a long time at all. I mean, it's an arbitrary.
It's one of 6,000, right?
You're absolutely right. Praise Satan. Anyway, I'm going to move on before we get into trouble. All of these indicators.
Oh, we're well past that point.
I'm not going to be
We're
there
well
for a
past
lot
the
of
point
reasons.
of being in trouble.
I know. all of these indicators can be found in some beautiful dashboards at globalchange.gov. If you guys want to just take a look at some climate data, take a look at some of the averages, and really get to know more of the facts outside of the very basic things. I mean, we talk a lot about climate deniers and things like that, but I mean, one of the best things that you can do in order to influence change, in order to discuss change, is to get to know the facts and not just the talking points. Get to know the facts. Look at these dashboards. See the changes, the trends that they propose on these dashboards, and actually get to know them from sort of a concrete standpoint. You don't have to be a data scientist. You don't have to be an environmental scientist to understand them. That's what they're for. They're really trying to push these out there. So yeah, once again, go to globalchange.gov and take a look at some of these indicators.
Yeah, and you'll feel smart while doing it.
Exactly.
What's wrong with that?
So moving on to I'm just going to hit a few more topics tonight, just in terms of advancements that we're making, in terms of looking at climate change, getting to understand our climate, getting to understand our Earth, and figuring out technologies that we can use to see if we can affect some of the impacts of the climate changing. So I was looking into this model known as the Glimpse model by EPA. Basically, it's a tool to find U.S. policy scenarios that simultaneously improve air quality, human health, reduce impacts to ecosystems, and mitigate climate change. It's designed to be fast and to allow decision makers to explore a range of options, as well as to be comprehensive and allow decision makers to avoid unintended consequences. So it's a massive scale physical model that really helps to tie that physical model into policy decisions. It's being developed by EPA and is going to be used to assist states with energy and environmental planning through the year 2050. The users of the tool can explore the impacts of energy technologies and policies on the environment. For example, it can be used to examine measures that promote energy efficiency, estimating the resulting energy savings, analyzing how emissions and air quality would be affected, and reporting how energy-related water use would actually change. And one of the nice things about that is it actually allows the analysis of additional technologies, including things like electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, wind and solar power, and carbon capture and sequestration. It gives a real look at what the impacts of taking some of these green energy technologies and implementing them in your city could actually have on your city from an economic standpoint, which is very compelling. Earlier, but sort of before we got onto this episode, we were talking about, and even in the last episode, we were talking about sort of the private sector based case for climate change, about how this could become a new economy for the United States, and it should have been a new economy for the United States about 15 years ago. Well, Glimpse actually gives you a glimpse at that. It's still under development and not yet publicly available, but the Glimpse research team is working with a small number of partners, and they're actually allowing people to be beta testers to help researchers improve the software. And you can actually volunteer for the beta testing. So check out the links on the EPA's website that we're going to have in the show notes. So on top of that, another big ticket technology from EPA is Markle. This one was developed as a multinational project, and it's been developed over almost 2 decades by the Energy Technology Systems Analysis Program of the International Energy Agency. It's a generic model tailored by the input data to represent the evolution over a period of usually 40 to 50 years of an entire energy system for a country. So that whether that's national, regional, state, or province or community level. So we're actually just talking about the energy grid itself here. And what's interesting about this, I mean, Jack, this is kind of my field. Or was my field for a while. It's interesting to have sort of a uniform capability to actually look at any country's power grid, and be able to have sort of a universal language to discuss nuances in the power grid and look at adding new technologies to that grid. I mean, that's really why this is significant. So this family of models has been communicated to 77 institutions in over 37 countries, many of those with developing economies, promising to continue and broaden their accomplishments thus far. So this is a real try in international cooperation.
So I mean, this is just another test case for why something within the scientific realm of policy, we're talking climate change, space, energy innovation, is a way to bring together a bunch of international partners that may not already have an existing doctrine of trust between them. So this could be the next international space station where we bring in countries that have previously been not a part of the international community in the scientific sense, and engage them on these scientific issues, on bringing them up to code on, or even developing the code for energy grid communication.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to remember that, despite some of the, very large scale policy decisions we see, very much, the leadership in the United States pursuing when it comes to energy policy. It's important to remember that, a vast majority of consumers do want renewable energy. I think it was Consumer Reports found recently that, a intensely overwhelming majority of Americans want renewable energy. They want their utilities to come from renewable energy. And interestingly, this one specific report found that this attitude was true even in like the heart of coal country, an area that you might assume would have a little more, loyalty to the industry that, runs their community. But, there
all
is
200
definitely
jobs.
all 200 jobs. But, there is a definite hunger for that here. And, the utility companies are definitely aware of that. I think they're definitely running a little scared. I don't have the exact report right on hand, but recently there was a news story about some messaging testing that American utility companies are trying to do because they are very aware that consumers want them to have renewable energy options, that people are tired of coal, they're tired of dirty energy, they want solar, they want wind, they want renewable clean energy resources. So that's something to be optimistic about.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you say that, because I've always said this, and a number of sort of the early adopters that I would talk to of solar energies and other green technologies would always talk about this at sort of their inceptions in the early 2000s, when it really came useful for more commodity level users. It's almost impossible to get folks to take on a next generation of technology that is not easier to use, install, and is not cheaper to use and install than the previous generation. And we're finally getting to that point where it's becoming easier to leverage some of these greener technologies, whether that's through companies like Tesla providing batteries and things like that, or how widespread solar panel companies have become. It wasn't always just the fact that these people really wanted their coal jobs or anything like that. It's that the technologies were harder to use in some cases, or there just wasn't that much information about them. Models like this and having cooperative organizations and projects like Markle actually contribute to creating more widespread knowledge about the use of green energy tools, as well as help businesses to identify how they can market some of these tools, these technologies, even at an even cheaper level than they ever have before. And that's one of the things that I think we have to look forward to in the coming years. Is we have all of these models now that say, look, this is cheaper, this is more efficient, this is better. And the private sector is following that model.
And I think even going into because my mind right now is entirely on next Tuesday, right? Is on how are people
Hey, Jack, what's next
this?
Tuesday?
I think it might be, I don't know, election day? Is that a thing?
I mean, you would think they'd have a holiday for that kind of thing. Come on,
You think, wouldn't you? But so one of the things I'm constantly thinking about, and an interesting article that I found about this involves the political impact of people's opinion of action on climate change. And it's not just the difference between it used to be. I think what we're talking 15, 20, 30 years ago is there was a public debate about whether climate change was real. I mean, this was in the era that widespread information about climate change at the time, often labeled global warming, wasn't as widespread. But as information was disseminated and people became more familiar with that information, going back to what you were saying earlier, Newton, people recognized that it's no longer an if, and it's a how are we going to address this problem of climate change. And that extends beyond partisan barriers. You'd think that even though there's still a difference in how those regulations on energy production or regulations on consumption, right, are debated on Capitol Hill, and a poll that I found from from Eco America, their American Climate Perspective September 2018 edition, they polled 849 respondents, all likely voters in this upcoming midterm election, and 90% of them said that Republicans and Democrats should find a way to work together to address climate change. And of that, the partisan breakdown, Democrats, it was 96%, Republicans, 83%, and the remaining middle ground, those independent voters, is 90%. So you see across the political spectrum, and this is, some of this is self-selecting. This is 849 online respondents to a SurveyMonkey poll.
So
right?
super scientific.
It's not well. I mean, it's not very scientific as us as people that deal with numbers, and sometimes we do. It's not an entirely scientific poll, but it does show 90% is very high. For 849 people in a topic that you would think isn't very bipartisan.
Now, when you need 37% of the vote in order to election. Anyway,
maybe that 10% is a little.
Oh, but like, when was the last time 90% of Americans agreed on anything? No matter how small the group, no matter what the issue.
Actually, that is an interesting question, one that I don't have an answer for.
You could make the argument that maybe it was Apollo, but even then,
no,
maybe
generally. So looking back at historical polling data, at the Apollo program at its height, 1967, when funding was the highest, public polling for the Apollo program was at its lowest. Still above 50% of people agree that we should have been doing it, but it was still not 90%.
I was going to say, Apollo wasn't as popular as we make it out to be. I mean, it was popular, but
looking back after the Apollo 11 landings and when it was really that sort of heyday of American pride that people want to harken back to sometimes a little too much. There were 70-80% of people supported the space program, and that was because we were on the moon, like we were doing these grand things. We're facing a monumental challenge here. And I don't want to call it a crisis, because a crisis makes it sound like there isn't a solution to it. This is a challenge being posed to the entire global community, of which 6 in 10 people worldwide agree that we should be doing something on climate change. And the remaining 4 of 10, a majority of those are saying we're not doing enough. I mean, if you look just at the numbers, this is now a Gallup poll that I had found.
There's a bad joke about how many of the 4 or 10 are Russian bots or in the White House, but
well, hey, they label it post-Soviet Eurasia, which includes a lot of Central Asia and the former Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, actually has the lowest percentage of support to preserve the environment and address climate change, with 41%. On average, 6 in 10 people worldwide, that's 65% in East Asia, 73% in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of those markets are that you're talking about that, we're making partnerships with. It's 56% of people are in favor of addressing climate change. And the numbers vary, Southeast Asia, in the island nations, of course, it's going to be a little higher because it is directly impacting their livelihood. Whereas
I was going to say, and it depends on where in Africa as well. I mean, it's hard to take a survey.
Yeah, sub-Saharan Africa is a very wide swath of cultures and governments and politics.
Yeah.
But I mean, just even going down to individual countries, looking just at China and India, two of the two biggest nations on Earth. In India has it's 77% of people think that we should be acting on climate change, 68% in China. That number drops to 47% in the United States and 33% in Brazil. And I like that they note Brazil, because Brazil is also, as of last week, some of our bad news, just elected an anti-science president. Yeah. And so I think there's something you can glean off of this, that in areas where people are more enthused and engaged on addressing climate change, you're seeing more action being taken. Yeah. And so in places like China and India, they're working, the government is centralizing a lot of authorities to address climate change, whereas in the US and Brazil, you're seeing a decentralization of that. In the US, the states are deciding, but some states are being more active in addressing climate change. In
Yeah.
Washington this year, there's an initiative called I-1631 that is going to require companies to pay $15 for every metric ton of carbon dioxide they emit beginning in 2020. That fee would then increase over time as they get closer and closer to their 25% carbon emissions reductions goal by 2035. After 2020, there's an estimated $1 billion more in state revenue that will be going to the state of Washington, that a lot of it's going to be geared towards clean air and energy investments for the state. So there's a lot going on, but there's more and more within our political system as public perception changes, and now 90% of Americans agree that Republicans and Democrats should do something. That states all across the country, not just in, liberal, hippy-dippy Washington state and New York, but in states all over the country, in Georgia and Florida, there are initiatives for carbon fees, carbon taxes on reducing the effect of carbon emissions on climate change. A group that I've done work with before, the Climate Leadership Council, is actually working with Congressman Carlos Curbelo, which he represents the southern tip of Florida, including the Florida Keys, to introduce legislation within the federal government on a carbon tax to help fund infrastructure investments in the area. Because, in 10, 20, 50 years, the Florida Keys might not be there. And these are major national landmarks that are being affected by climate change, and you're seeing support all across the aisle.
That's very true. And that's an interesting point you raise about the Florida Keys. Eastern Maryland is facing a lot of very similar issues right now as well. The very eastern shore of Maryland tends to be a little more conservative. These are communities that rely really heavily on fishing as an industry. So they're simultaneously grappling with the issue of, a lot of these islands that people have lived on for generations might not be here in not that long. And then on top of that, with the difference in, rising sea temperatures, pollution, name 1,000 things that are wrong with the Chesapeake Bay. There are more than 1,000 things wrong with the Chesapeake Bay. You're seeing these little tiny communities that really do rely on the crab harvest, really, now inescapably staring down the barrel of, things have gone wrong. And, you're at this really interesting intersection where, being a conservative person does not necessarily mean that you don't believe in climate change, that you don't believe in, seeing the truth with your eyes in front of you about how your environment is changing. So just, an important thing to remember, hopeful it's not all about party lines. People notice, people are waking up, people are paying attention.
It's true. And it's funny that you sort of mentioned the conservative line of thinking on this, because one of the ways that I saw that was sort of most apparent over the last year was our favorite guy, friend of the show, Bridenstine. Right, so just
Jimmy B.
Yeah, I know. Honestly, knowing what we know about Bridenstine, we on this show, we talked about it a number of times. We weren't necessarily afraid of him going and being the head of NASA or cutting climate programs within NASA, particularly because of our work with the Planetary Society and things like that. We kind of knew where he stood, but the question was always sort of where he had to stand publicly in order to get elected in Oklahoma, right? So you saw sort of his stance as a beginning candidate, with him basically going and saying, there's nothing to this climate change thing, going all the way to climate change is actually happening and we should actually be studying it, which is his current position on it right now, that we need to continue studying it. Yes, and he kind of leaves it sort of ambiguous as to what's causing it and things like that, because NASA doesn't have to actually report on that. They don't have to report. They don't have to report as far as actions that we need to take. They just need to report that it's happening effectively.
Well, he has publicly come out at the Washington Post event, did talk about anthropogenic climate change as a major challenge that the United States is going to have to overcome. And that, again, across party lines, we're seeing more and more conservative, mainly Republicans, pick up the mantle and say, well, whether you're an incumbent or not, you're hearing constituents and potential constituents talk a lot a lot about climate change.
The word's getting out.
Yeah. And
it's an amazing
not just
shift. It's not that long ago that, we were at the stage of people just flat out refusing it was a thing at all. And now we're not only getting acknowledgement of climate change, but anthropogenic climate change. That's a huge jump. And a lot of that is due to pressure by constituents, people being aware of this issue and letting their elected officials know this is an important issue to me and I'm going to vote about it.
It's almost like civic activism works.
Shocking. That works.
So maybe after next Tuesday, if you continue to write your member of Congress about things, they might change.
Whoa. You're telling me this isn't over after next Tuesday?
No. Election day is next Tuesday. You got 364 more days of civic activism, my friend.
Yeah.
All right, only 364 more though. But so I can't have us finish this topic without talking about the big guns. So we talked a little bit about what EPA is doing, and mixed into that a little bit about what NOAA is doing. We talk USGCRP and the Geological Survey, but there seems to be one group that's missing from that bucket. I don't know if you could tell me who, Jack.
Space Force.
I swear to God. So here we go, because I really wanted to to actually dedicate some time to this. So NASA is just one of many agencies that has multiple programs performing breakthrough research on climate science, enhancing the ability of the international scientific community to advance global integrated Earth system science using space-based observations as well as observations from sensors here on Earth. NASA's research encompasses things like solar activity, sea level rise, the temperature of the atmosphere and the oceans, the state of the ozone layer, air pollution, and changes in sea ice and land ice. You've seen their scientists regularly appear in the mainstream press as climate experts. So how did the space agency end up taking such a big role in climate science? Well, I'm going to walk you through that. So, strap in. So, when NASA was first created by the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, Jack, do you remember what day on 1958 that actually happened?
That would be October 1st.
That was when the agency was started. Do you remember what day the National Aeronautics and Space Act?
Oh, I know it's your birthday. But...
Yeah, it is. There it is. Yeah, it's July 29th. So when NASA was first created by that act, it was given the role of developing technology for, quote, space observations, but not Earth science. The agency's leaders embedded the technology effort in an Earth observations program centered at none other than the new Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. And that's in the U.S., by the way, in case anyone was wondering.
For now.
It was dubbed a, quote, applications program in NASA speak. Other agencies of the federal government were responsible for carrying out Earth science research. And you're familiar with a few of those, like the Weather Bureau, which is now known as, Jack?
NOAA.
Yes, there you go. Was that a guess, or did you actually know that?
I sort of knew that.
Oh, so you didn't know that.
That was sort of a little bit of both. I had heard it before. It was in the deep recesses of my mind.
So yeah, the Weather Bureau and the U.S. Geological Survey were the ones that were just some of those agencies that were tasked with that. This wasn't any of NASA's business. They had no business doing this. But the applications program signed cooperative agreements with these other agencies that obligated NASA to develop observational technology while NOAA and the USGS carried out the scientific research. So NASA builds the capabilities, NOAA and USGS do the science, make with the science. The applications program resulted in things like the Nimbus series of experimental weather satellites and the infamous Landsat series of land resource satellites. This applications model of cross-agency research actually ended up failing during the 1970s, though, due to the bad economy and an extended period of high inflation. Congress responded by cutting the budgets of all three agencies, leaving NOAA and the USGS unable to fund their part of the arrangement and putting pressure on NASA too. At the same time, congressional leaders wanted to see NASA doing more research toward, quote, national needs, end quote. Sound familiar? Some of those needs included energy efficiency, pollution, ozone depletion, and climate change. In 1976, Congress revised the Space Act to give NASA authority to carry out stratospheric ozone research, formalizing the agency's movement into the Earth sciences. Now, NASA's planetary program actually had a lot to do with scientific and congressional interests in expanding the agency's role in Earth science. The JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is NASA's lead center for planetary science, sent Mariner series probes to Venus and Mars. Astronomers consider these to be the Earth-like planets in the solar system, most likely to have surface conditions able to support life. I don't know if you remember when we knew this little about Venus and Mars, but so instead of actually finding the ability to support life, what they actually found on Venus is an extremely hot surface. You remember the quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson where he often says you could cook a pepperoni pizza on the surface in just like a couple of minutes or something ridiculous like that. I don't know why he does
I don't even know if it's a couple minutes.
I think it's seconds actually. I think it's like 90 seconds.
Yeah, I mean that atmosphere is nasty.
Yeah, although we're thinking of living there now. They've been seeing more and more reports about that.
Oh yeah, with
Really?
the high altitude balloon things.
Yeah, that's an old concept, but I've been seeing it pop up in like the popular science like magazines lately.
I've been seeing it in a few of the like not popular science, but like more derivative of that, like more just popular culture magazines that also talk about science.
Yeah,
I think it was I can't remember. If I find the article, I'll link it in the show notes.
New York Times had something recently on that.
There was one in the New York Times. It wasn't as, I guess, fantastical as some of these other articles have been. A lot of them claim that NASA is currently working on a proposal to send humans to Venus, even though it's not 100% true.
Please no.
Not 100% true. So, there's some shoddy journalism still going on in some of those popular culture magazines. Hey, at least we're talking about it.
This is why science writing is important, folks. And science writers are important. But the reason it's that hot on its surface, sorry, we get off on a tangent. In contrast to the Earth, Venus is about 300 times more carbon dioxide in its own atmosphere, no significant water vapor, and a surface temperature hotter than molten lead. Mars, on the other hand, was at that time found to be completely barren and inactive. It had an atmospheric pressure about 1% of that of the planet Earth, and temperatures far below freezing. Pictures of Mars showed no surface water. It would have been frozen anyway, but they also seemed to show that it once had liquid water. These discoveries left planetary scientists with a ton of unanswered questions. Things like, how did Earth, Venus, and Mars wind up so radically different, but come from similar origins and be in such common places within our own solar system? How could Mars have once been warm enough to be wet, but be frozen solid now? These questions revolve around climate and the intersection of climate, atmospheric chemistry, and on Earth life. And this is one of those things that this works both ways, because Jack, you and I have had to defend planetary science for a long time to folks, as well as climate change, and the two really do intersect. You learn about one by studying the other. You learn about Earth's climate by studying other planets' climates. Otherwise, you only have a sample of n=1, right? This is why we study Saturn. This is why we study Jupiter. This is why we study Mars. We have to understand how climates in general work before we can say, oh, we just have a model that we're confident in here on Earth.
I mean, it's almost like having a larger data set gives you better clarity of data, right?
This is crazy talk, old man.
This is totally like
overarching theme of the episode.
It's way out of left field. The whole intersection of science. Like you might be able to learn something if you don't know something.
But to kind of wrap up NASA's story here, but just as planetary scientists began confronting those kinds of questions, Congress lost interest in planetary exploration at that point. NASA's planetary exploration budget sank dramatically starting in 1977, and the Reagan administration threatened to terminate planetary exploration entirely. This is partly due to high inflation in the U.S. and partly due to the agency's focus on the space shuttle, which could only reach low Earth orbit. The shuttle focused agency leaders' attention on studying the Earth from orbit, not on the other planets. The space shuttle Atlantis, was one of the kings of those. Speaking of Florida, because I believe that's still down in Florida, correct?
Atlantis is in Florida, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's at Kennedy Space Center. Sorry, I just saw a picture on here.
Yeah, Discovery's up here, Atlantis is down
Yes,
there, and
yes.
then where's Enterprise? I think, is that one out in California?
Enterprise.
I think so.
Yeah, the fifth one.
I was gonna make a Star Trek joke, but never mind.
No, it was named with a contest, and that's people chose Enterprise
I know,
because
I
of Star Trek, right?
Considering what you end up with some other public contests, I mean, Enterprise isn't bad.
Shuttle McShuttleface,
That was too easy, Jack. That was way too easy.
Booster McBoosterface.
So that around that same decade, there was a massive revolution in scientists' understanding of Earth's climate. Prior to the mid-1960s, geoscientists believed that our climate could only change relatively slowly on timescales of thousands of years or longer, but evidence from ice and sediment cores began to change their minds. Earth's climate had changed rapidly in the past. They'd even discovered that it could change rapidly in just a few decades. Recognition that climate could change on human timescales began to spur political interest, as you would imagine. It had been known since 1960 that humans were increasing the amount of heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Scientists also knew that human emissions of aerosols could cool the Earth. A 1975 study, in fact, by the U.S. National Academy of Science said that, in effect, we don't know, give us money for research. And a 1979 study of carbon dioxide's role in the climate put it slightly differently. They had found, quote, no reason to doubt that climate changes will result and no reason to believe that these changes will be negligible. Declining planetary funding and growing scientific interest in the Earth's climate caused planetary scientists to start studying the Earth. It was closer and much less expensive, and NASA followed suit, starting to plan for an Earth observing system aimed at questions of global change. And in 1984, Congress again revised the Space Act, broadening NASA's Earth science authority from the stratosphere to, quote, the expansion of human knowledge of the Earth, end quote. What a noble mission. In the early 1980s, NASA began working on an expansive Earth science program plan called Global Habitability, and that eventually became the mission to planet Earth. At the same time, a multi-agency effort called the Global Change Research Program, which we just talked about, had taken form. NASA's role in that larger U.S. program was the provision of global data from space, and this is where NASA really took on that role of being the data provider, actually having all of these capabilities and shipping them out to both U.S. agency programs as well as international programs. Approved in the fiscal year 1991 budget, the resulting Earth observing system would be the agency's primary contribution to American and global climate science. Now let's fast forward to 2007, and NASA has 17 space missions collecting climate data. Today it runs programs to obtain and convert data from Defense Department and NOAA satellites, as well as from certain European, Japanese, and Russian satellites. NASA also sponsors field experiments to provide ground truth data to check space instrument performance and to develop new measurement techniques. Instruments on NASA's Terra and Aqua satellites have provided the first global measurements of aerosols in our atmosphere. In December 1999, we launched Terra as the flagship mission of the Earth observing system, just to answer the question, how is Earth changing and what are the consequences for life on Earth? Terra carries 5 instruments that observe Earth's atmosphere, ocean, land, snow and ice, and energy budget. Taken together, these observations provide unique insight into how the Earth system works and how it is changing. Terra observations reveal humanity's impact on the planet and provide crucial data about natural hazards like fires and volcanoes. The instruments on board the Aura satellite study the processes that regulate the abundance of ozone in the atmosphere. Data from GRACE and ISAT missions and from spaceborne radar show unexpectedly rapid changes in the Earth's great ice sheets. And I can go on and on. There's a million different missions that NASA has in their Earth observing system that have aided us over the last 30 years. These capabilities, nearly 30 years of satellite-based solar and atmospheric temperature data, helped the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change come to the conclusion in 2007 that, quote, most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. And their most recent findings that was in the news lately about the 1.5 degrees Celsius impacts, increase in climate, which could impact weather here on Earth very soon. But there's still a lot to learn about what the consequences over time will be. Most recently, they've used these kinds of technologies to construct a 60-year record of Arctic sea ice thickness. We've done things like use AIRS and MISR to keep tabs on Hurricane Michael from space, looking at having MISR look at Hurricane Michael from about 9 different camera angles, each of which viewed Michael over the course of approximately 7 minutes when it was just off the coast of Florida. I could go on and on. We are launching more and more missions as we go forth. JPL is launching 5 new NASA Earth Science campaigns, including one from NASA from Pasadena, which we'll take to the field starting in 2020. So while we're arguing about whether or not it exists in some corners, we're getting more badass technology coming down the pike, regardless of policy.
So a lot of action being taken, and that does have a trickle down effect on politics as we get again. Just going back to, I guess, this.
Are they going to throw away money that we're currently spending on all of these missions? I mean,
and I mean, there's an economic incentive. I mean, part of the reason why Bridenstine accepts climate change as fact is that as a member of Congress, he saw the impact that some of these programs had on agricultural production in Oklahoma, and being able to track storms and be able to predict extreme weather events helped save lives and save economies in the heavily agricultural state of Oklahoma.
And they're going to have a major impact on a new field called precision ag, where they realize that we're going to have to actually tie data together from those microsensors that we have that are being used to analyze the growth of crops, and weather data and climate data that we're collecting from all of these satellites. I mean, this.
Yeah, and so not even just from that, and that's just one aspect, right? That's one reason why people are not excited to work on addressing climate change, but are motivated to work on this. And so for some, it might be an agricultural issue. For some, it might be economic. For some, it might just be a humanitarian thing. I mean, look at the increasing refugee crises in areas affected by extreme weather events. I mean, we're seeing there's arguments to be made that some of the conflicts in the Middle East and Central Asia are being exacerbated by water shortages and famines. I mean, just look at Yemen. It's close to, I think, 1/3 of the people in Yemen are going to be starvation or famine prone within the next 5 years if action is not taken on the dispersion of water to more crop fields there. And so these issues that we're dealing with and being able to track with, better and more advanced technology is enabling us to tackle even bigger problems that are beyond the scope of just sea level rise or just extreme weather events off the coast of Florida, right? There are things, cross-cutting effects of climate change that we're going to be able to address with more and better data and a political consensus of 90+% of people across the political spectrum saying that we need action on climate change.
That's all. Yeah. So that's all I've got on sort of my survey on sort of the positive aspects of what we're doing in climate change right now. We're discovering a lot. We're moving the ball forward, regardless of the arguments that are being had in the halls of power. Good research is still happening. New technologies are still being developed. I don't know, Zoe, what do you got? What do you think?
What I think is, I've heard it said a lot recently that sort of a silver lining of the American political climate, specifically in the last 2 years, but for a little bit before that as well, is sort of a broadened, how do I say this, sort of a more wide-scale, sort of stark realization of what it is exactly we are facing. And I mean that on a number of topics. For a specific podcast, we could talk about climate change specifically. But, I think people are, we're finally on a broad scale acknowledging that, the change is happening, The challenge is real. And understanding, I think there's been an increased understanding, specifically in the last 2 years, about sort of the intersectionality of these issues, right? Like climate change isn't just about sea level rise. Climate change isn't just about rising temperatures. People, I think, the public at large, I think, has a deeper understanding now about all the various ways climate change impacts your day-to-day life as an individual in a way that we as a society just either didn't understand or weren't willing to have conversations about not all that long ago. And I think that's, it's a cause for hope. Yes, it's frustrating that it's taken this long to get this far, and it's definitely scary when you look at the IPCC report, and you see how much time we don't have to take a lot of steps much further. But I think it's important not to discount how far we've come, and more than anything else, if I had to close on anything, it would be the importance of resisting hopelessness, right? Like, it's so easy to look at climate change, to look at what we're facing, to look at people have thrown around the terms like apocalypse, like doom. Like, these aren't words that seem so, overblown anymore, right? But it's important to not lose hope, because, the moral of the IPCC report is that, that's what happens if we don't do anything. Right? Like, there are so many things that we can do.
That's a good point.
So many things that, these ongoing projects we've just listed are moving us towards. It's so important to have the data. Like, you can't do anything without solid data. And, we have so much data. There are ongoing projects to get more data. And, the social pressure is there in a way it wasn't previously. There can always be more social pressure, but, it's important to remember that there's still reason for hope. Things are still going to change. Shit's still going to get even realer, but it doesn't necessarily spell the end of everything. There are still things we can do and things that we should do, and giving up means that we lose.
Yeah, and I mean, just to sort of wrap that up, one thing that I would love to be able to see, and I don't know how humanity could quite learn a lesson from this. I think at some point, given everything you just said, Zoe, given everything you just said, Jack, that at some point we get to the point where, okay, we're fairly at consensus in terms of public opinion when it comes to climate change. I think that will actually occur. What I would like to see us get to as a public, as a populace, is the point at which it doesn't require it to impact us immediately for us to understand that the results of scientific research are reality. Like that is one thing that sort of speaking as an educator and as well as speaking as a scientist, that's where I would like to see us get to. I'll take this once again. I mean, Jack, I'll take the W where I can get it. I'll take the win with us getting consensus on this eventually, and just knowing that that's what we're trending towards. But I think this merits a longer discussion about how we can get the public to sort of understand these abstract things, because this isn't the last threat that humanity is ever going to face. And we need to get to the point through education where people can understand, even if the field is not their specialty, what it means to have specific results in science, and what it means to be able to comprehend some of the latest findings, even if it's not your specific career path.
So I think going off of that, I think there's two things that need to continue to happen. And one, it's our job as educators, as advocates, as people who are in the business of communicating these complex ideas in a succinct, well, maybe not so succinct, because it's, we're over an hour and 15 minutes at this point, but it's our job.
There's a lot of positive news, all right?
There is a lot of positive news, but it's our job then to continue having these conversations about very complex and difficult conversations with people that maybe aren't going to agree with us, and going into communities that aren't predisposed to having access to this knowledge or have an understanding of this knowledge. So, going back to the Midwest and going, to the Rust Belt and talking to coal miners and talking to auto manufacturers and talking to, unemployed people about why this is an important issue to discuss, and also encourage the next generation to take an interest in science, technology, engineering, mathematics. I won't throw the A in there because I know that you don't like that word very much.
For the record, one, I like art, and number two, I need people to take more than just an interest in it. I need it to become a part of life, just like reading literacy is a part of life. I need scientific and math literacy to become a normal part of American life.
It just needs to be part of our critical set of skills moving forward. And I just want to say the last thing, and this will be my last little talking point, is that there also needs to be a reliable source. There needs to be a reliable list of options for action. And I think something that I've been seeing day in and day out over the last 4 weeks that there is just this push that I have never seen before for people to get involved in voting and civic activism. And I think some of the, we've talked about this before, Newton, but some of the things that, that we talk about on the show might be a little dense and aren't as well disseminated to your regular, your average voter. But having that option and having those conversations can aggregate into civic action, which then pushes your elected officials and potential elected officials to take action. And so in the show notes, there's also going to be a link. So the climate, or let me get their name right, but the Vote Climate US PAC put together a comprehensive list of all the scores for people running for federal office in, it seems like, all 435 House districts in all 50 states, and how they score on their position on climate change action, on carbon tax. And you'd be surprised to see the number of Republicans in the House in challengers for U.S. House positions, and incumbents that support action on these things. So I'll link that down in the show notes.
So Jack, before we get out of here, though, I since you mentioned getting involved, one way that you can actually get involved is through a brand new app, fresh out of the bowels of San Francisco, California. Bowels may not have been the best word.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think anything about San Francisco screams bowels to me.
I don't know. Have you been to San Francisco? Not a fan. Yeah. So I have a great friend and colleague there who has started a mobile app company called Rise Up Inc. And she has developed, and her company has developed the app Rise Up, both for Android and iPhone. And effectively what it is a platform for organizing. So if you're sitting around wondering if there's a volunteer activity that you can do, if you're lying around on your couch wanting to, wondering, is there an activity that I can do at Planned Parenthood today? Is there a march occurring? Is there a volunteer event or a Get Out the Vote event occurring? Just boot up Rise Up, and you will be able to see all of the events that are going on in whatever area that you're in. So if you're on travel, this thing works. It's got a great UI, and it's actually gamified so that you earn points and rewards for volunteering and organizing. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Hey, anything to get people engaged for those 364 other days of the year. So I guess that is it for our show. This was our happy episode. I want to say thank you to Zoe for joining us and giving her commentary. It's always great to see and hear from you. Newton, always good to see and hear from you as well. And for all of those things that you need to know about climate change and the happiness that it is surrounding climate change right now, there are links down in the show notes, as well as a whole section on how to get involved. Next week, if this episode goes up on Wednesday, we're talking in 6 days, there is a major national election. Please, 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 please vote every year, every damn time you need to vote, and get involved in your community using the Rise Up app, whether or getting involved in your local council, whatever it be. Just be active, do something.
I'm going to tag on to that. It's important to vote on every line item on your
Yes.
ballot. Don't just vote for your members of Congress. There's a lot of great apps out there. We'll link some websites in the description that, can really break down by your exact zip code in your exact area who is on your ballot, what are all the issues on your ballot. Vote all the way down. Every level is important. Do it. Please do it.
Please, this is a personal plea
Please.
now.
Please.
All right, I think we'll leave on that note. Thanks, Zoe, once again.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right. Well, as always, I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.